So the talk that I'm going to give today is called People Like You, and it's about unacceptable responses to unacceptable behaviour. This talk covers the debilitating impact of this type of statement for every victim survivor of gender-based violence. Statements like this reek of a preset agenda by service providers and/or practitioners. They demonstrate a failure to listen to the individual, and they can result in a victim being left at risk or put at further risk. They can lead to a lack of trust in services, both in the short term and the long term, that an individual needs to access for health and safety. And they can be underpinned by a sense of victim blaming. So gender-based violence, some key points to draw your attention to are that rape and sexual assault are the least reported of violent crimes due to barriers to data collection. And of those incidents reported, victims with disabilities suffer more than twice as many abusive incidents before reporting. 2/3 of domestic abuse victims have been subjected to more violence from partners during lockdown, and intersectional oppressions are often overlooked. Using legislation to respond to context, agenda, and identity, we can turn to the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Part 1, where Article 1 says that we should all be free and equal, and that people are not owned. And Article 2 says that we shouldn't discriminate. So, for example, in terms of gender, race, sexual orientation, class, or caste. And the world of women sees issues such as FGM or female genital mutilation, forced marriage, and coercive control. And women's struggles will see issues about the right to own our own bodies, e.g., being able to provide consent as to whether we wish to have sex. UN Declaration of Human Rights, Part 2. Article 16 speaks of marriage and the family and highlights that there should be a legal age where there are no child brides, and that multiple marriages frequently lead to wife neglect. And Article 19 says that we should be able to say what we want and to have a voice. And Article 22 says that there should be the right to social security in order to eliminate poverty, because poverty is a key factor in gender-based violence. Other key legislation is related to disability and general equality. The United Convention on the Rights of the Person with Disabilities, 2008, highlights our rights, whereas many disabled people have been abused or are victims of gender-based violence. The Equality Act, 2010, highlights 9 protected characteristics and covers intersectionality. And the CARE Act, introduced in 2014, looks at a local authority's responsibility to do assessments for vulnerable people. And this was updated in 2016 and the latest report in 2021. In terms of autism, the Autism Act was introduced in 2009. And the National Strategy for Autistic Adults in England followed this, and it was called Fulfilling and Rewarding Lives, and stipulated that autistic people should have a voice in services and research and anything impacting on them. In fact, our voice should be to the fore. And there was a review of this in 2013. The Think Autism strategy came into play in 2014, and that had a critical element in relation to the criminal justice system. This was updated in 2015 and also 2019 and 2020. So, specific issues impacting on neurodivergent survivors. We all have communication differences, but for neurodivergent individuals, some of us have preferences where if those aren't used, we can't have meaningful conversations with people. So, for example, some people might find the telephone really difficult to use and prefer to have things written down so that they have time to look at it and reflect on it and make sense of it. We need time to process information. So, for example, there could be many of us who, if we're bombarded with questions, again, might not be able to process these or understand what's being asked of us. We might have sensory differences in terms of hypersensitivity or hyposensitivity. So in terms of touch, we might generally find touch very difficult in relation to our autism, but in relation to being a survivor of sexual violence, this might be exacerbated. And this has strong implications for our care and support. In terms of masking or echopraxia, this is where we copy other people's facial gestures, behavior, even things that they say in a bid to fit in. And first of all, it can be extremely exhausting, but also there's a dissonance between what we're feeling inside us and how we're coming across. So obviously that can be quite problematic, both for ourselves or for other people engaging with us and trying to support us. Alexithymia, or difficulty identifying emotions, can be difficult if people are trying to ascertain the impact of something on us, how we felt at the time, how we feel now. And if we don't have words to express this, we'll need specific support with that. Autistic inertia is an issue which essentially means being unable to respond in the moment. And it could be that maybe we're not able to say something right then, or we say something which the next day we think, well, actually, this was completely different. And although many people might say this happens an awful lot to autistic people, or can do, and particularly if we've been traumatized and in situations related to gender-based violence. The double empathy problem has been around for many, many years, but in relation to autism, was placed on the agenda by Milton in 2012. And essentially what it means is that non-autistic people don't understand autistic people. And actually, autistic people very often don't understand non-autistic people. So that there's no meaningful conversation that is happening there. And it's very important then to ascertain people's individual communication preferences and make sure that both parties are engaged in a meaningful conversation. In terms of monotropism, this was something that was identified by Murray, and et al. And it's about having a narrow attention funnel where we have a real focus where our attention is drawn into that. But that's good if our focus and attention is on something positive, on the detail of that. But if our focus is on something traumatic, that could be good in terms of reporting the detail, but in terms of our recovery, can be quite difficult, because if we keep being drawn back into that tunnel where we're experiencing trauma, we need specialist help from people who understand autism and neurodivergence. In terms of intersectionality and gender-based violence, I've shown a number of areas in which, or ways in which this could occur, and it's informed by our unique identity or identities and one or more forms of gender-based violence, including rape, sexual assault, domestic violence, stalking, abuse, CSE or child sexual exploitation, honor-based violence, FGM or female genital mutilation, and modern slavery. So turning now to the victim-survivor's narrative, each survivor is unique, and so our narratives will be unique. They may cover issues such as whether we're neurodivergent, certainly what our gender is, our race, issues regarding language may be important. Certainly whether the case or the incident or incidents are historical or current or critical, our sexual orientation and our culture and faith. There will be very many other identities that come into play, but here's a selection of some. But then also understanding the context of a victim's gender is critical in establishing a number of issues, such as whether the incident has been reported, whether the victim survivor's injuries are due to gender-based violence, whether the neurodivergent victim is masking, and what the communication preferences are of the victim survivor, so that we can have meaningful conversations. And we need trained staff and teams so that they also have a clear action plan. In terms of service provision, bad practice is clearly characterized by an agenda where practitioners do not listen actively. So they could hear what we're saying, but they're not really paying attention to it. So they fail to enact safeguarding if needed. An individual's data is not treated with the appropriate confidentiality. And above all, they do not cater for the needs of all individuals, e.g. neurodiversity. So effective health service provision is where medical services understanding of an individual's present circumstances is essential for building trust. This may link to our history. So relevant records, past and present, should be accessed. Records may prove critical to what happens in the provision of care and support and the processing of sexual violence cases. Survivors lack trust in services. Research evidences that a lack of trust is often pinned by situations like where providers have assumed a position of moral high ground, when services have a preset agenda, often misogynistic. If a survivor's agenda is being gaslit, or if a survivor feels blamed in terms of both their neurodivergence or gender-based violence, or both. there are many practices and services which are fantastic and really well constructed. But this talk is about those that are not good and where survivors lack trust. So in terms of power and fear, this is often institutional, and we see discrimination. So an individual may not feel able to report due to a loss of control over a situation. They may feel that no one will believe them. They may not feel protected, and perceived discrimination around same-sex relationships is often a barrier to individuals seeking help. And South Asian women are 3 times less likely to report due to honor and shame. And the link between power and fear can be seen where an individual's motivation for power is to acquire control over their environment. And the higher their wish for control, the more likely that fear is imposed. This relates to services, communities, and perpetrators, among others. And it reduces the prospect of victim survivors being able to access services and be heard. Power and fear in action. So in terms of things that were said to me, we have a place for people like you. What sort of place? It was a misogynistic response by a male consultant who ignored critical relevant information and imposed his agenda over mine. Sexual violence is about power and control. So I was asking myself whether this practitioner was trying to control me. The statement was intimidating. Victim survivors do not need those who are meant to believe and support us to wield power and intimidate. In terms of trauma, so responses to trauma by victim survivors of gender-based violence falls into 3 main groups: physical, emotional, and behavioral. In terms of physical, we can see things like muscle tension, tiredness and exhaustion, tightness in the chest, erratic heartbeats, headaches, or a dry mouth. Emotional responses may be where a victim survivor is depressed or irritable. They may have nightmares or feel very guilty. They also may have anxiety and panic, and experience poor memory and insecurity. And in terms of behavioral responses, this may be evidenced through increased drinking or smoking, or different habits and twitches, a change in eating patterns like increased eating or less eating, and personal neglect. They may also engage in non-stop talking and impulsiveness. So service providers responding to trauma in victim survivors need to know when someone is in danger. A victim survivor should never have to repeatedly report before action is taken. Our experience and reactions need to be understood in context, and we need to be offered appropriate and timely support. And we need help to voice our feelings and experiences. So a trauma-based approach for neurodivergent victim survivors is where service providers are adequately trained. They build empathy with a victim survivor. They offer a range of communication options. They avoid jargon and use the terminology and language used by the victim survivors. And they allow time for the survivor to process information And victim survivors need to have easy access to services. They need support to think about the type of support on offer and that they wish to access. And they need an opportunity to check that there's understanding both ways, so that the person providing support understands them, and that they also know, the supporter knows that the victim survivor is understanding what's being said. So there's a two-way flow of information. And steps to recovery need to be broken down into achievable amounts. Good service providers are there to believe survivors, provide support, check communication preferences, note intersectionalities, listen actively to survivors, engage meaningfully with survivors, and understand that survivors are the expert in their feelings, and work with individuals to voice issues. So neurodivergent individuals taking the case through court, there's some key issues here I would just like to highlight. So first of all, communication preferences that I've already talked about need to be understood. So we need to be able to have full access to the court process. So we need to have reduced sensory overload. So if a certain court has different types of lighting or acoustics, that needs to be one that's offered to us. There needs to be an understanding of the impact of masking, so that if people think that we look very relaxed, we might be copying someone's behavior, but it might not be what we feel like inside. There needs to be an understanding that we'll probably be overwhelmed by information, as are most victim survivors, but even more so if they are neurodivergent. So we need time to process information and questions. And very often, due to both trauma and neurodivergence, we will have a poor memory. So people in court need to work to understand that. And there needs to be an understanding of the roles of individuals by the witnesses in court, so the victim survivors. And we also need to be able to understand the court process, because both of those factors will enable us to respond better and to process information and questions better. So in terms of training and inclusion, effective mental health provision to a neurodivergent survivor of sexual violence and assault would benefit from insider training and expertise. It should be based on insider expertise. It is essential to comprehending the difference between various types and the impacts of gender-based violence, minority neurologies, such as autism, and different reactions due to neurodivergence and sexual violence or gender-based violence. We need to have service provision, trainers, and resources addressed in terms of accessibility and diversity. So service provision should be accessible and it should be diverse. The trainers, again, need to be diverse, and resources need to be accessible and diverse and informed by people who are using those services. And this would set up a system which addresses inclusion access, and ultimately equity. So the importance of appropriate service responses to gender-based violence is that the incident may not have been reported. It leaves the perpetrator on the streets and others at risk. Safeguarding is essential for protecting victim survivors, and our reactions often expose poor safeguarding practice. Defamatory statements further exacerbate trauma, and an atmosphere of fear due to inappropriate practice and responses may result in a survivor feeling unable to access services. These inappropriate responses need to be called out to protect our human rights. So in terms of the statement, people like you, what does that mean? At the time I needed support, it has actually been said to me on several occasions since I returned to the UK. I have a number of intersecting and oppressed identities. I'm a woman, I'm neurodivergent, I'm disabled, and I'm a survivor of sexual violence. So I don't know what that statement means. Every time a statement like this or similar has been said to me, it has had a critical impact on my ability to trust practitioners. And in terms of discrimination, I mean, the UN Declaration on Human Rights, Articles 1, 2, 3, and 4, look at services being fair and equal, look at no discrimination happening, look at the right to life. Well, although it didn't impact on me, honor-based violence is an area where it clearly impacts. And modern slavery, again, is an area where it impacts. So this type of statement is completely inappropriate. It demonstrates an assumption of authority, a failure to understand the issue, context, or agenda, a failure to listen, a failure to not acknowledge intersectionality, and a failure to communicate meaningfully. We need change. Individuals and institutions who wield powerful judgmental statements place barriers in the way of survivors accessing support, gaining justice, and recovering. Survivors should always be believed, and there is never a place for statements like, "We have places for people like you." Urgent training is needed to enact change. So, as a survivor, I am someone who has supported my children. I have gained a doctorate. I have rebuilt my career. I have become a successful author, speaker, and trainer. I use past negative experiences to support others. I continue to build on my well-being, and I have built a supportive network of friends and colleagues. A survivor should always be validated. They should always be actively listened to. They should always be able to make informed choices about reporting and support providers. And one day, maybe we will see a societal shift in focus from blaming and shaming victims to one which endeavours to end gender-based violence.